Harassed chef loses everything but discovers her ex-boss's millionaire crime and turns her life. The night was heavy. The air in Lavella's kitchen was hot and dense, saturated with steam and the varied aromas of dishes being prepared at a frenetic pace. Aaliyah James, 35, with a brilliant career as a chef, was masterfully in control of the chaos. Her keen eyes scanned the kitchen as she chopped ingredients with the precision of a surgeon. Every order that passed through her hands came out perfect, as if time and fatigue never affected her. For Aaliyah, the kitchen was a fortress, the only place where she had absolute control. But that night, a dark shadow loomed over her. The clock was nearing midnight, and the restaurant was finally starting to empty. The waiters were cleaning tables, the pans were cooling, and the sound of doors closing behind her indicated that her shift was about to end. It was at that moment she felt a presence behind her, a nearly physical weight in the air. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Richard Blake, the restaurant owner, was there. A man nearing 50, with a smile that always hid sinister intentions. He moved with an arrogance that made everyone around feel small. And he had decided that tonight, it was Aaliyah's turn to be diminished. "You're still here?" Richard asked in a cold tone, though there was something almost syrupy in his voice that made Aaliyah's skin crawl. It was the voice of a predator. Aaliyah swallowed hard, maintaining a firm posture as she set aside the knife she was using. The last thing she wanted was to cause an incident at that hour. "I'm finishing the last dish. Anything I can do for you?" Her tone was professional, distant. She tried to keep her emotions locked away, as she always did when Richard approached. However, the feeling of discomfort was inevitable. Richard didn't respond immediately. He moved closer, until the proximity between them became unbearable. Aaliyah could feel the heat of his body, the invasive presence. His scent was a mix of expensive whiskey and something else, something that made her stomach turn. "You could do many things for me, Aaliyah." The words came out in a deep whisper as he reached to touch her shoulder. Aaliyah's heart raced, the instinct to flee screaming inside her. Richard's touch was an invasion, something she feared, and that had been intensifying in recent weeks. She pulled away sharply, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her eyes locked onto his with a mix of fear and anger. "I'm not interested, Richard. Please, step back." He stared at her, his eyes narrowing, the smile disappearing from his lips like a snake preparing to strike. He moved closer again, this time grabbing her arm tightly, his fingers digging into her skin. Shock and pain immobilized her for a second. "You think you can ignore me? I made you chef in this place. You'd be nothing without me." His voice was now low and threatening, each word laden with hatred and possessiveness. He was dangerously close, his breath hot and full of alcohol. Aaliyah felt panic rising within her. With a sudden movement, she tried to break free, pushing him hard. Richard didn't expect the reaction, stumbled back, hitting the spice shelves that crashed to the floor with a loud noise. But he didn't retreat. On the contrary, his expression changed to something even darker. The kitchen, once a sanctuary of focus and control, was now a prison. The sound of metal shelves hitting the floor echoed, amplifying Aaliyah's inner chaos. She picked up the knife that had fallen and held it firmly, but not to attack. It was more a reflex of self-protection. "You'll pay for this." Richard's voice was a lethal whisper. He pointed a finger at her, as if sealing a fate. Aaliyah's head spun. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Taking a deep breath, holding back tears, she dropped the knife, which fell to the floor with a sharp, definitive sound. "It ends here, Richard," she said, trying to stay calm, but her voice came out shaky, fear and adrenaline still high. "You won't intimidate me." However, the only thing that ended that night was Aaliyah's job. The next morning, while trying to forget the events of the previous night, a cold email appeared in her inbox. "You're fired. No further explanations, no defense. Inappropriate conduct with management, And don't expect a recommendation letter for another job, the text read, as if she were the one at fault. It was as if her entire career had been erased with a single decision. The restaurant she had given her life to now tossed her out as if she were disposable. And Richard, protected by his wealth and influence, walked away unscathed, as always. Aaliyah felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. No job, no plan B, with a child to raise alone. She felt anger mixed with despair as she read and reread that email. The tears she fought to hold back finally rolled down her face. She had always been strong, always refused to be a victim, but now she was destroyed. Her hands trembled as she closed the laptop, her heart shattered. And then the even harsher reality hit. What would she do now? With Ethan, her 10-year-old son, facing the trauma of the recent divorce, the boy no longer spoke. Ethan's selective mutism was the latest wound in a series of misfortunes that Aaliyah couldn't stop. How could she start over? How could she rebuild her life and still care for the son who needed her so much? Aaliyah's world seemed to collapse around her. Ethan watched her, silent, from the corner of the room. His big, inquisitive eyes tried to understand what was happening, but the words were trapped inside him, just as the answers were trapped inside her. It was in that moment of complete vulnerability that Aaliyah realized she had no choice but to leave the city, everything she knew. Greyhaven, a small coastal village where her grandmother had left a house, would be her last hope. A place she hadn't visited since childhood, but now represented her only chance to start over. An escape from Richard, from the pain, from the shame, and above all, a desperate attempt to give Ethan the chance for healing he so desperately needed. The journey to Greyhaven was long and silent. Aaliyah drove with her eyes fixed on the road, while Ethan remained silent in the back seat, watching the scenery pass by as if it were a mere projection. She felt the weight of her son's gaze, the absence of the words he had abandoned, as if they had died with his parents' failed marriage. The silence between them was deafening, but there was a veiled acceptance. It was as if both knew that this moment of escape represented the only way to try to start over. As the car wound along the roads leading to the village, the landscape changed dramatically. The streets of the big city vanished, giving way to roads lined with tall trees. The sound of birds echoing in the distance, and the smell of sea salt began to penetrate through the partially open window. Aaliyah knew she was approaching the coast. Memories of childhood in Greyhaven began to surface in her mind. Afternoons on the beach with her grandmother, the smell of the shells they collected, the cold waves lapping against her small feet. But those memories now seemed distant, as if they belonged to someone else. And then, finally, they arrived. Greyhaven was a village hidden among hills and cliffs. Small, weathered wooden houses were scattered along the coast, with an uninterrupted view of the vast Atlantic Ocean. It was a place that seemed frozen in time, like a relic of a simpler era. Aaliyah's house was at the end of a dirt road facing the sea. When they got out of the car, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was almost deafening, but there was something comforting about it. Something she couldn't explain. Her grandmother's house, however, was not in the best condition. The white paint was peeling, the windows covered in dust, and the wood creaked under her feet when she opened the door for the first time in years. The smell of mold and sea air was strong, but Aaliyah knew this was just the beginning. She would need to rebuild not only that house, but her life. "This will be good for us, Ethan," she said with a hesitant voice, trying to convince both herself and her son. She looked at the boy, hoping for some sign of response, but he just walked slowly to the porch, from where he could see the sea. His small shoulders slumped, his expression blank. Aaliyah let out a long sigh and began unpacking, thinking of the countless things she would need to fix. The first days in Greyhaven passed at an almost slow pace, as if time moved differently there. Aaliyah immersed herself in household chores, cleaning away years of neglect and trying to turn the old wooden house into a home again. Every corner seemed to hold memories of childhood, but these memories came stained by the weight of reality. She wanted to believe that the change would be good for her and Ethan, that the coastal village would bring the necessary healing. But the pain and insecurity lingered like shadows, hard to dispel. Every morning, Ethan would silently disappear to the beach. He woke up early, put on his shoes, and without a word, walked towards the ocean. The salty sea breeze seemed to be his only solace, but he never talked about what he felt. Aaliyah knew that her son's silence was not just a symptom of the recent trauma of the divorce. There was something deeper there, a loneliness she couldn't reach, and it ate away at her. One day, while out looking for Ethan, Aaliyah found him kneeling near the water's edge. At first glance, she thought he was just playing with the sand, but as she got closer, she saw what really held him there: a stranded dolphin, injured and weak, fighting for its life. Aaliyah's heart raced. The animal was huge, its shiny skin covered in scratches and wounds. Ethan, still mute, gently stroked the dolphin's back with his small hands. His eyes, usually so empty and distant, were filled with emotion, a connection Aaliyah hadn't seen in him for months. "Ethan, get away from there," Aaliyah said with a lump in her throat, but the boy didn't move. He just looked at her with tears in his eyes, unable to form any words. The weight of that moment hit Aaliyah in an overwhelming way. It was the first time in so long that she saw something break through Ethan's silence. The decision was made quickly. Aaliyah didn't know much about handling marine animals, but she knew that dolphin needed help. She ran back home, grabbed her phone, and called the local marine reserve. In less than an hour, a white truck with the reserve's logo appeared on the beach. Mark Sullivan, the marine biologist who got out of the vehicle, seemed calm and experienced. He was in his early 40s, with slightly graying brown hair and a serene expression that immediately conveyed safety. He knelt beside the dolphin, examining its wounds with careful and precise hands. "It's a young female," he said after a few minutes, "probably hit by a fishing net. If we're lucky, we can save her." While Mark worked, Ethan didn't take his eyes off the animal, and something began to change in the boy's expression. He seemed mesmerized by Mark's presence and the way he handled the dolphin. That interest, that spark in his eyes, was something Aaliyah feared she'd never see again. Mark quickly arranged for the dolphin to be transported to the reserve. He talked to Ethan, trying to involve him in the process. "You know, these animals are incredibly intelligent," he said in a gentle tone, but without infantilizing the conversation. "Did you know they communicate with each other using sounds and whistles?" Ethan nodded, still not speaking, but clearly fascinated. Aaliyah watched the scene with a tight heart. That man, with his calm and patience, seemed to be the first person to break the invisible barrier that kept Ethan locked inside himself. After a while, the dolphin was taken to the reserve, but Mark promised Ethan he would come back to tell him how the animal was recovering. The discreet smile on Ethan's face was small, but for Aaliyah, it was a monumental victory. For the first time in a long time, she saw hope in her son's eyes. However, what Aaliyah didn't know was that the encounter with the injured dolphin was just the beginning of something much bigger, something dark that she couldn't foresee. In the following days, Mark came back a few times to give updates on the dolphin, and with each visit, he and Aaliyah began to form a connection. There was something in his tranquility that made her feel safe, something that starkly contrasted with the emotional chaos she had been living. He talked more about his work at the reserve and how the local marine life was threatened by illegal fishing nets operating in the area. Mark was passionate about what he did, and Aaliyah, who had lost so much of her own passion for cooking, felt a growing admiration for him. But the mystery behind the illegal nets kept expanding. With each visit, Mark brought new information about how the operations were destroying the marine ecosystem. He mentioned that he had reported the activities to the authorities, but nothing seemed to be done to stop the nets. One day, Mark arrived at Aaliyah's house with a serious look, different from his usual calm. "Something is very wrong here, Aaliyah. The nets we found are much more sophisticated than anything I've ever seen before. This isn't local fishing. It's something much bigger." Aaliyah felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know what that meant, but something in her intuition told her that revelation was far from the end of the problem. The more Mark investigated, the clearer it became that the illegal fishing was being funded by a powerful and dangerous operation. That night, as Ethan slept, Aaliyah pondered everything that had happened since they arrived in Greyhaven. Mark's presence and Ethan's visible improvement were reasons for relief, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Mark's worried look echoed in her mind, and she couldn't ignore the growing feeling that they were about to get involved in something dangerous. That feeling proved true faster than Aaliyah expected. One morning, while going out to get the newspaper, she noticed something strange on the doorstep. An unmarked envelope was lying on the ground, without a stamp or addressee. Upon opening it, she found a single sheet of paper with a short, direct message. "Leave Greyhaven, or you'll regret it." Aaliyah felt her stomach turn. Who had left that there? Who knew she was investigating the illegal nets? Fear began to spread like wildfire. What if she was putting Ethan in danger? She immediately called Mark, who arrived at the house in less than an hour. Showing him the note, he was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the threatening message. "This isn't good," he finally said, his voice grave. "They know we're getting too involved. We need to be careful from now on." "But who are they?" Aaliyah asked, feeling anger mixed with fear. "What's happening, Mark? Who's behind all this?" Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. He knew that revealing everything to Aaliyah would put her in danger, but he also knew she deserved to know the truth. "I don't have proof yet, but there are rumors that this illegal fishing operation is being funded by someone with a lot of power. Someone who's willing to destroy the marine life of the region to make money." "But who would do something like that?" Aaliyah's question was almost a whisper, but the name Mark mentioned next made her world stop. Richard Blake. The name fell like a stone in Aaliyah's stomach. Richard, the man who had ruined her life, who had fired and humiliated her so cruelly. She didn't want to believe he could be involved in something so nefarious, but at the same time, it made sense. Richard had always been driven by greed and power, and illegal fishing was just another way for him to profit at the expense of others. Now, at the expense of the environment. The revelation left Aaliyah stunned. Suddenly, everything made sense. The nets, the authorities' reluctance to act, the threatening note. Richard had the contacts and the money to cover up anything, and now he was involved in a scheme that not only destroyed marine life, but also put the Greyhaven community at risk. "I can't let him continue with this, Mark," Aaliyah said, blood boiling in her veins. "I've already lost everything because of him once. I won't let him keep causing more destruction in the world. I need to do something." But she knew that the decision to confront Richard wouldn't be easy. Mark's investigation could put them in danger, and Aaliyah had Ethan to protect. Confronting Richard meant opening old wounds, exposing herself to new risks, and possibly losing even more than she had already lost. The next morning brought with it a sinister calm. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and the ocean wind blew colder than usual. Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table, the threatening note in hand. The coffee cooled in the untouched cup before her, while her mind revolved around a single thought: confronting Richard. She knew she had two options. The first was to follow the implicit advice of the note and leave Greyhaven, abandon the investigation, and try to hide. But fleeing meant letting Richard win once again. He had already taken so much from her career, her dignity, her confidence. And now he was trying to destroy the only place where she and Ethan had started to find peace. The idea of giving up sickened her. The second option was much more dangerous. Facing him head-on, exposing the truth about his illegal fishing network, and fighting against the threats he was imposing. But that would put her directly in Richard's crosshairs, and she knew what he was capable of. Ethan's safety was at stake, and that was the only thing that mattered. With each passing minute, Aaliyah felt the weight of the decision crushing her. The fear was undeniable, but something bigger was growing inside her. An old anger, fed by years of humiliation and forced silence, bubbled to the surface. She couldn't allow Richard to keep destroying everything he touched. She had to fight, not just for herself, but for Ethan, for the Greyhaven community, for the marine animals being victimized by his greed. Mark appeared at the house by the end of that morning, and the tension in the air was palpable. He knew that Aaliyah was considering a dangerous decision, and it worried him. "Aaliyah, I understand what you're feeling, but we can't act impulsively. Richard is a powerful man. He has money, contacts. If we go against him without a solid plan, he'll destroy you again." She stood up from the table, her gaze firm. "He already destroyed me once. I let him break me. I won't let that happen again, Mark. This time, he won't win. This time, I'll fight." Mark saw the determination in her eyes, but fear was also present. He knew that Aaliyah was at her limit, driven by past trauma and the need to protect her son. "We need concrete evidence," Mark said, trying to appeal to her rational side. "We need something that incriminates him, that forces the authorities to act. If we go to them now, with what little we have, it could be a shot in the dark." Aaliyah paused for a moment, reflecting on Mark's words. He was right. There was no point in confronting Richard without a plan. She knew that Richard had already escaped justice before. He was cunning, manipulative, and knew how to play the power game. If she went to him without something concrete, she would be crushed again. And this time, Ethan would pay the price. "Then let's get the evidence," she said with a firm voice. "You have contacts at the reserve. I'll talk to the people in town. Someone here knows what's going on and is afraid to speak. If we put the pieces together, we can expose him." Mark nodded, but there was still hesitation in his gaze. He knew they were treading dangerous territory. "We have to be discreet, Aaliyah. If Richard finds out we're going after him, he might take steps to silence us, and he won't hesitate. From what you've told me about him, and from what I'm seeing he's capable of doing, with this whole scheme, we're in danger." In the following weeks, Aaliyah and Mark began to act in secret. Mark investigated the illegal fishing operations, trying to trace the funding and find a direct connection to Richard. He spent hours at the Marine Reserve, talking to biologists and local fishermen, looking for any clue that could lead to something concrete. Every day, they got a little closer to the truth. Meanwhile, Aaliyah used her growing network of contacts in town to talk to the residents. Greyhaven was a small community, and most people knew someone who had heard rumors about the illegal activities. But no one was willing to speak openly. The fear of retaliation was too great. Richard's influence extended beyond what Aaliyah imagined. He had friends in high places, people who could easily cover up his activities or make any threat disappear. One afternoon, while talking to one of the town's oldest fishermen, Aaliyah finally got an important lead. The man, named Earl, was sitting on his porch, his face marked by time and sun. He was known for being a man of few words, but there was something in his eyes that told Aaliyah he knew more than he was letting on. "I heard about the nets," Aaliyah said, trying to broach the subject carefully. "It seems to be affecting the marine life around here, and no one is doing anything about it." Earl remained silent for a long moment, watching the waves crashing on the distant shore. He took a deep breath and then spoke, his voice low and drawled. "Everyone here knows what's going on, girl, but no one will talk. The man running this, he's dangerous. There are people here who've already lost a lot trying to meddle where they shouldn't." Aaliyah felt a chill run down her spine. "Richard Blake," she whispered. The old man blinked, as if the name cast a shadow over him. "Yeah, Richard. That man has the town in his pocket. The few who tried to stand up to him ended up regretting it. They've even tried to raid his base, but they couldn't." Aaliyah leaned in closer, her heart racing. "What?" Earl looked around as if afraid of being overheard, and then said, "He has a base, far from here, where he keeps the nets and the operations equipment. It's in an abandoned warehouse near the cove. If you want proof, that's where you'll find it." The information hit Aaliyah like lightning. It was what they needed, a location where they could find physical evidence of Richard's illegal activities. But she also knew that going there meant putting herself directly in harm's way. If Richard found out someone had tampered with the warehouse, he could retaliate mercilessly. That night, Aaliyah sat down with Mark to discuss the next step. The warehouse was the key to exposing Richard, but the operation would have to be precise. "We can't get caught," Mark said, while drawing a rudimentary map of the area. "If Richard or any of his men see us there, we're finished." "I have no choice, Mark," Aaliyah replied. "I need to do this. It's not just about me anymore. If I let Richard continue, he'll end up destroying more lives. My son's life has already been affected by what he did to me. I won't let him win again." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew that no matter what he said, Aaliyah was determined. He saw the fire in her eyes, a fire that couldn't be extinguished. "Then I'll go with you," he finally said. "If we're going to do this, let's do it together." And so it was decided. The next night they would go to the warehouse. It was a risky move, but it was the only chance they had to expose Richard once and for all. Night fell faster than Aaliyah expected. She was nervous, her heart pounding in her chest as she and Mark prepared for the mission. They waited until darkness completely covered Greyhaven before leaving, with the streets empty and the sound of the ocean waves as the only soundtrack. The warehouse, as Earl had described, was in an isolated area, far from town, near the cove. When they arrived, the place seemed even more desolate than Aaliyah had imagined. A rusty metal structure, surrounded by trees and dense vegetation, almost hidden from view. The silence that hung over the place was unsettling, as if even nature knew it was a place of dark secrets. Mark took a flashlight and they both advanced slowly, trying not to make noise. They circled the building, looking for an entrance that wasn't blocked. The warehouse seemed abandoned at first glance, but Aaliyah knew she couldn't let her guard down. Richard probably had guards or cameras to monitor the place. Finally, they found a partially open side window. Mark forced it carefully, making as little noise as possible, and Aaliyah entered first, followed closely by him. The interior of the warehouse was even darker, with the smell of dust and rust permeating the air. There were stacked boxes, tarps covering equipment. Aaliyah couldn't identify, but she knew they were related to fishing. "There," Mark whispered, pointing to a corner where several heavy nets were stored. They were rolled up, with tags confirming what they feared. They were illegal fishing nets, designed to catch an absurd amount of fish and, consequently, injure or kill other marine animals in the process. Aaliyah approached the boxes, feeling her stomach churn with disgust and anger. She took out her phone and started taking pictures, documenting every detail. These photos would be the proof they needed to report Richard. She knew that with these images, he couldn't escape. But then, a sound interrupted the silence. Aaliyah froze. Footsteps. They weren't alone. Mark immediately turned off the flashlight, and they both crouched behind a stack of boxes. The footsteps echoed through the structure, slow, heavy. Aaliyah held her breath, her heart beating so hard she feared the sound would be audible. The main door of the warehouse creaked, and the lights came on. A man in a dark suit entered. It wasn't Richard, but someone clearly in his service. He began inspecting the place, and more, his presence approached where Aaliyah and Mark were hiding. Aaliyah felt sweat trickle down her forehead. If they were discovered there, they would be dead. Mark grabbed Aaliyah's arm tightly, preventing her from moving. The man in the suit was getting closer and closer, his footsteps echoing through the empty warehouse. Aaliyah's breath was caught in her throat, and she could feel her heart beating so hard she feared it would give her away. The man stopped just a few meters from where they were hiding. The dim light revealed his hard, expressionless face as he spoke on the phone. "Yes, Mr. Blake, everything is in order here. The new shipments arrived as planned." He paused, listening. No sign of that nosy chef or the biologist, but if they show up." His voice dropped to a threatening tone. "We'll take care of the problem permanently." Aaliyah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. They knew. Richard knew she was investigating. The fear threatened to paralyze her, but then she thought of Ethan, alone at home, waiting for her. She couldn't fail now. The man continued his inspection, getting even closer. Mark and Aaliyah pressed themselves against the boxes, praying not to be discovered. It was then that Aaliyah's phone, still in her hand, vibrated. A message from Ethan. Her heart stopped. The man froze his movements, turning slowly toward the sound. "Who's there?" His voice echoed through the warehouse. Mark acted instantly. He stood up, emerging from the shadows on the opposite side of where Aaliyah was hiding. "It's me," he said, hands raised. "I was curious about what was going on here." The man drew a gun. "Mark Sullivan. Why am I not surprised?" He smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "Mr. Blake will be pleased to know we finally got you." Aaliyah watched in horror as the scene unfolded. Her heart screamed to help Mark, but her mind knew she needed to take advantage of the distraction. The photos on her phone were the only evidence they had against Richard. While the man kept the gun pointed at Mark, Aaliyah began to move silently toward the exit. She had to get help. She had to save Mark. But then her foot hit an empty can, the metallic sound echoing through the warehouse like a gunshot. The man turned abruptly. "Looks like we have company," he said, his smile widening. "Come out from wherever you are, or your friend here gets shot." Aaliyah closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and made her decision. She couldn't let anyone else get hurt because of her. Slowly, she stood up, her hands trembling. "Aaliyah!" "No!" Mark shouted, but it was too late. The man laughed. "Perfect. The boss will be very pleased. 2 birds with 1 stone." It was at that moment that everything changed. A deafening noise filled the warehouse, police sirens. Red and blue lights began to flash through the dirty windows. "Police! Come out with your hands up!" The henchman's face contorted in shock and anger. He quickly turned, pointing the gun now at Mark, now at Aaliyah, clearly panicking. "How?" he began to ask, but Mark interrupted him with a smile. "You really thought we'd come here without backup?" Mark said, his voice now filled with confidence. "Earl isn't the only one tired of Richard Blake's crimes." Aaliyah realized then. While she was openly investigating, asking questions around town, Mark had been working behind the scenes, building a solid case with the authorities. They were never really alone. The police stormed the warehouse, and the man was quickly disarmed and handcuffed. While the officers searched the place, collecting evidence, Aaliyah ran to Mark, throwing herself into his arms. "You planned this all along?" she asked, still trembling. Mark hugged her tightly. "I couldn't risk your life. Richard Blake is more dangerous than you imagine. We needed to catch all of them at once." The following hours were a whirlwind. The police found not only the illegal nets, but also documents linking the entire operation directly to Richard Blake. Financial records, fake contracts, evidence of bribery. Everything was there. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. When Aaliyah returned home that night, exhausted but relieved, she found Ethan sitting on the porch. Seeing her, he stood up and, for the first time in months, spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice small but clear, "I knew you'd do it." The tears came instantly to Aaliyah's eyes. She hugged her son tightly, feeling as if an immense weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Finally, after so long, they were truly free. In the following weeks, the fallout from the investigation unfolded like a hurricane. Richard Blake was arrested, his criminal empire collapsed, and the truth about the harassment Aaliyah suffered came to light. Her reputation was restored, and several renowned restaurants approached her with job offers. But Aaliyah had other plans. Greyhaven had become her home, and she couldn't imagine leaving that place that had healed both her and her son. With the help of the local community, she transformed her grandmother's old house into a seaside cafe, serving dishes that combined her gourmet experience with fresh local ingredients. The cafe became a gathering place for locals and tourists, always packed with people eager to taste the food of the chef who had helped dismantle one of the region's largest criminal operations. Ethan, now speaking freely, began helping Mark at the Marine Reserve on weekends, his love for marine animals growing every day. And Mark, well, he became more than just a partner in fighting crime. One quiet night, while walking along the beach where they had found that first injured dolphin, he proposed to Aaliyah. She said yes, of course, knowing that sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as challenges. The last time Aaliyah saw Richard was in court during his trial. He seemed smaller somehow, without all his power and arrogance. When their eyes met, it was she who smiled, knowing she had defeated not only him but her own fears. That night, sitting on her porch with Ethan and Mark, watching the sunset over the ocean, Aaliyah realized that sometimes you have to lose everything to find exactly what you need. Life had given her a second chance, and she was determined to make the most of it. And as for the dolphin that started it all, it still occasionally appears in the bay in front of the bat house, as if checking to see if everything is okay with the family that saved it. For Aaliyah, it is a constant reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles begin with an act of kindness. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. Every story I tell is made with dedication and care, aiming to touch the heart of the listener. If this narrative stirred something in you, consider subscribing so we can continue on this journey of telling stories that move. Your support is crucial for us to continue sharing these unique experiences. Stay safe, and we'll meet in the next story.